You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 27th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu makes his case to the United Nations. South Korean prams likelier to carry beagles than babies, and should employers check up on their sick workers? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers who did not head for the exit with sufficient alacrity are Mariella Bevan and Hassan Anderson. They will discuss the day's stuff, plus we'll have the latest from a busy and rowdy UN General Assembly, and we'll hear from the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign correspondent Yaroslav Trofimov about his foray into fiction. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and first to Beirut, where in the last few hours a massive Israeli airstrike has destroyed several residential buildings in the South Beirut suburb of Dahia. Israel claims the target was Hezbollah's central military command centre. It is not clear as we go to air whether Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah was on the premises, and if so, whether he was among the casualties. Well, I'm joined now from Beirut by the journalist Hannah McCarthy. Hannah, as I was saying, this is only happening in the last couple of hours. Do we know anything for certain?
So what we've heard from a source close to Hezbollah is that Hassan Nasrallah is alive, but we've also heard reports that Iran is also checking on his whereabouts, on his condition. So it's a still slightly murky position right now. It's not 100% clear that Hassan Nasrallah was definitely there. Israel is saying that he was there and they operated on that intelligence. And it's not clear that if he survived, is he injured? At the moment, it looks like he has survived. But again, whether he was injured or not isn't clear yet, and so we'll be kind of waiting to get a clearer picture of that over the next few hours.
Is it clear, however, that the premises that was hit is what Israel is saying it is? I mean, it's obviously not the only time that Hezbollah has installed its offices inside residential buildings, but the Israelis seem to be suggesting that this was a major Hezbollah command centre inside or underneath these residential blocks.
Look, journalists aren't allowed down there at the moment. It's a very tense situation. It's a massive strike site. About 6 buildings have been flattened. Rescue workers are there at the moment. So it's not something we can easily verify at the moment. We're seeing, a large strike site in the middle of a very built up residential neighborhood. Windows across the city shook. Families were kind of screaming. People were bringing their children down to the basement. And I'm a couple of kilometers away from the site, and that was happening in my neighborhood. So people are quite shaken. But the extent of whether this was a Hezbollah command center or not, I'm sure that those details will come out over the weekend.
It does seem depressingly likely that whether Nasrallah was there or not, the casualties from this will be considerable. It is, as you say, a crowded neighbourhood. I've been there myself. It is very, very hard to imagine that there will not be dozens, if not hundreds, of dead and injured from this strike. Are Lebanese authorities saying anything at all yet about the figures of casualties?
We're only just starting to get initial reports in. One report is saying there's 11 in a critical condition. We've got reports that one person who was transferred to a hospital is already dead. But again, I think it's going to be a very messy situation for the next couple of hours. If it is indeed a Hezbollah command center, the site will be very heavily controlled. So it will be hard for press to get in. But it's a large site. So I was at the strike site last Friday in Dahia, where I think about 60 people were killed. And this is bigger than that. So, I think you're right that this could be quite a significant civilian casualty. The only hope is possibly that because of the previous strikes, there were less people in this area. Perhaps there was some people, who left Dahia, so maybe it wasn't as crowded as last week.
We can only hope. Just finally, Hannah, and again, it's very early days. Have we heard, to be clear, anything definitive from Hezbollah themselves? I know there are reports from sort of Hezbollah-adjacent media saying that Nasrallah was not there, and or if he was, he's okay. But have we heard anything from the organisation directly?
We don't have an official statement. We have a source close to the party speaking to AFP who saying Hassan Nasrallah has survived. So I say that's the kind of best statement we have at the moment, that he is still alive.
And would we be expecting, though, if that is the case, to be hearing from him in the next few hours? Because it wouldn't be the first time, of course, that he has been reported dead.
Well, look, I think we're in slightly uncharted territory about whether he wants to do a video or not if he is alive. I mean, it's certainly something that seems likely to kind of keep morale up, to show that, in the face of a massive Israeli barrage, he has survived. It certainly seems like quite a strong move to do if he is in that condition. But if he's injured, he may not be in a position to. It may not be worthwhile to do a video while he's significantly injured.
Hannah McCarthy in Beirut, thank you for joining us. And we'll continue now in the United States, where this year's gathering of the United Nations General Assembly has not been short of talking points. Earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did one of his signature show and tell presentations, brandishing charts and maps as he made the case for taking on Hezbollah. Other visiting leaders have taken the opportunity to make or renew the acquaintance of potential future US President Donald Trump, including UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Well, joining us now from Washington, D.C. is the reporter H.J. Mai. H.J., for the benefit of those of us who only saw Benjamin Netanyahu on silent monitors waving his strange maps and charts around, what did he actually have to say today?
Well, I mean, he really, what the world saw was a defiant Benjamin Netanyahu. I think, what he had to say is what we've been hearing now for, close to 10 months. It's, he reiterated Israel's right to defend itself against Iran's proxies, specifically, obviously talking about here Hezbollah and Hamas. And yeah, he mentioned that, this will continue until, people in northern Israel will be allowed to move back to their homes. So clearly the goal here is to push Hamas back, to decimate, in this case, Hezbollah, to decimate Hezbollah in Lebanon. I mean, you just, talked about obviously this strike that happened this morning. And the same is true for Hamas. I mean, he, seemed confident that, Hamas is really at the moment, the military capabilities of Hamas are decimated. And, the goal is now to bring those hostages home who are hopefully still alive in Gaza. But yeah, it was clearly a defined, Netanyahu, who also called out the United Nations for, according to him, some, anti-Semitism within the body. And basically reiterated that in the current form, the United Nations is just, a toothless organization.
Was it clear what he was doing with the maps? He had these sort of color-coded placards with different regions of the Middle East shaded in different colors.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure, that those maps really, got the point across that he probably wanted to make here. But, just for people who haven't seen it, yeah, he held up a map of the Middle East, one with the headline, The Blessing, which showed Arab states that, in recent years have engaged with Israel, try to really, establish some geopolitical and even commercial ties to Israel. He specifically mentioned there Saudi Arabia. And then the second map, which was, color-coded in black, had the headline, The Curse. And it showed Syria, Iran, Yemen and Iraq. And basically, those states that want to destroy Israel. And, he basically asked the body and the world as his audience this morning, what future do they want? The one where, Israel and some Arab nations are working for the betterment of the region, or, the curse, as he called it, countries who want to wipe Israel off the map.
Well, let's talk a bit about some of the extracurricular sideshows of this UN General Assembly. There was a meeting today, and there had been an amount of will they, won't they going on beforehand between former President Donald Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Judging by their appearances together afterwards, how well would you say they're getting on?
I think, they played the part. But I think this relationship is clearly a strained one. Donald Trump, the former president, reiterated his desire to, should he get reelected, to end the war in Ukraine. He called it, there should be a fair deal for both sides, for Ukraine and Russia. It were comments like that where Zelensky chimed in and basically said, hey, it was Russia who started this war. Don't forget about that. And so they definitely have a strained relationship. But I think, those meetings are necessary, given that the former president clearly has a chance to win the election. And if that's the case, then Ukraine is clearly fearful that the U.S. support would dry up under a Trump presidency.
It's been a recurring pattern with Trump, though, that he does say one thing when, he's just playing to his audience, and then does often seem somewhat more abashed when he's in the presence of people to whom he might be accountable or who are directly affected by whatever it is he has been saying. In recent days, as you've suggested, he's been fairly emphatic that he's perfectly happy to sell Ukraine out. Was there any toning down of that once he was, having to say stuff while standing literally next to its president?
I think, he was still, he kept his line, but he clearly said, I think his line was that he learned a lot from the meeting. And when asked, after their one-on-one meeting, Zelensky and Trump actually appeared on Fox News. And when asked about, what a fair deal would really look like, Trump was evasive and basically said it's too early to talk about that. So clearly he wants to keep the talks ongoing, and he doesn't want to say that, as you just called it, that he wants to sell out publicly Ukraine. And I think, he wants to, figure out a solution. But it was definitely still a strange moment to see both of them, and clearly, both of them at the moment, the way they speak publicly about each other, are not happy with each other.
Well, there was another will they, won't they meeting that ended in a will as well, which was the meeting between Trump and the UK's Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. Is Trump hoping, do you think, and is he reasonable to hope that this does actually play well for his election campaign? Even if they're having to bite their tongue, it's understandable that these leaders do feel like they need to meet him. He might be president again, but is Trump, do you think, going to benefit from being able to present a statesman-like appearance?
I think the last part of your question there is really what is the benefit here. If those world leaders, Keir Starmer, Volodymyr Zelensky, if they meet with the former president, with the front runner here in the Republican Party, it makes him look, like somebody who's on the cusp of entering the White House again. It makes him look like a statesman. So I think that's the only real positive. I don't think it has a lot of impact on how voters here in the U.S. will vote, but it definitely, publicly, it makes him seem like, a guy who can lead this country again, potentially. And so I think, from a public relations perspective, those meetings are helpful to his campaign.
H.J. Mai in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and I am joined now for today's panel, a truncated one given the amount of stuff going on in the world. Monocle studio manager Mariella Bevan and radio producer Hassan Anderson. Hello to you both.
Hello.
We will be discussing South Korea, where stories about its demographic tailspin have been a recurrent theme of coverage of the country, and not surprisingly, as the numbers are extraordinary. There are around 52 million South Koreans now on current projections, and assuming South Korea remains resistant to immigration, by the turn of the 22nd century there will barely be 26 million South Koreans. For a more micro depiction of the crisis, we are indebted to the South Korean online retailer G-Market for the revelation that this year, for the first time, baby strollers are being outsold by pet strollers. Hassan, first of all, before we get into the what this represents, pet strollers. This is news to me.
I know. What is the world coming to?
why do you need a stroller for a pet? This is a rhetorical question. I'm not accusing you.
No, I mean, actually, you could be, because I did consider getting one for my fairly recent acquiring of a dog.
He's quite a big dog, though. We've met him.
He's a big dog. He's been into the Monocle office once, perhaps the only time, given how chaotic it was. But he's 15 months, so still technically a puppy. But when I first got him, he wasn't allowed outside for about 6 weeks. So I was essentially in puppy lockdown, because if he was to go outside, he might catch parvovirus, which is something that they can get from foxes, and in puppies can be lethal. So if you take them outside, which you should do, because they get a bit stressed out if they don't get to do that, you can either carry them, or you can put them in a crate, or you can put them in a buggy or a puppy stroller.
So are you saying there is in fact a case for the puppy stroller?
I'd say that yes, for certain circumstances, but when you kind of put it side by side like this in a kind of maternal way, it becomes ridiculous. I agree. Yeah.
Does this play into the narrative, Mariella, and it's a fairly familiar one, not just in South Korea but elsewhere, of people having pets, not really as pets but sort of as substitute children?
I mean, it's certainly easier to have a dog than a baby, I would say, and cheaper.
I can test that.
Although when I had my mum had the puppy, obviously I don't have my own child, but I didn't realise quite how much it takes, and I think there are a lot of people that don't necessarily realise that. But I think having a stroller, a pet for a pet, there are limited reasons why you might do that. Being senile might be one of them. As Hassan mentioned, another one being puppies. So in either end of the
spectrum. This is the pet or the owner?
Sorry. The pet, obviously, yes.
I think both is the answer to that. There is actually a lady near my flat who rolls around with a puppy stroller with 3 pugs. And I do question her sanity at times.
3 pugs is too many.
Yeah.
That is impressive, getting 3 pugs in there. I did actually see one on the London Undergrad recently. I was coming around the corner, and I did assume, as you might, that it was a baby, but no, it was actually a chihuahua in the stroller. So it does happen. I have seen it in real life.
I mean, is this, or is it just the thing as well? Because it's not just that people are projecting, I think, their ambitions of children onto their pets because it's possibly cheaper and easier. Is that the thing, though, that's what governments like South Korea's, which purport to be concerned, Hassan, by demographic tail-off, won't address, that having a child has become prohibitively difficult and expensive?
I would say that that's definitely the case, and it's true in more places than South Korea. We've seen, that question of birth rate become a problem for a lot of different countries, and it's because the cost of living is a global problem. The idea of having a child is not just lightly taken anymore. It requires a lot more that we have to just take for granted. So, yes, there are reasons for that I think are very real. Whether or not pet strollers indicates the sale of pet strollers indicates we're all swapping babies for puppies is another question. And I think that actually, well, at least in the UK, when I looked into this, families who parents or people that have families and children are more likely to have dogs. So actually, at least in the UK, I think that a kind of house that is fit for kids, or the kind of people that are willing to take on those responsibilities, are actually going to be more likely to want to get a dog too, to complete that sort of unit. So I think that this is a slightly false comparison. But yeah, nevertheless, I think that in South Korea, the birth rate is falling, and it's an issue that is, a bigger societal problem.
I am already concerned that somebody has already thought of building the combined pet and baby stroller to cater for those people you were talking about.
Found a niche in the market.
Exactly. But Mariella, is that what governments like South Korea's and others with similar concerns should be driving at, rather than fretting about it, which they often do, trying to find ways, incentives for people to have more and bigger families, that they should just figure out how to make it cheaper for people to do it?
I definitely think that people should be making it easier and cheaper to have children. A lot of women are having to give up their work in the UK, at least, to be able to look after children because they're not earning enough to cover the cost of childcare. So I think it's important that governments do cater to people and make sure that women can actually afford to have children instead of not just having pets.
If we could be a bit sort of sneeringly judgmental of the people buying pet strollers, however, I will put this to you, Mariella. Is there an issue with people somewhat anthropomorphizing what are basically animals? I mean, anyone who has a pet does that to some extent, I'm sure. But this is a symptom of the same syndrome in which people refer to themselves as being parents of their pets, which should be an arrestable offence.
Yeah, you definitely see that. People who kind of bring their pets on planes and give them human food and things like that. I think that is a bit of a danger. And pets are they're not humans,
No.
although some people do treat them that way. And I think this is maybe the next stage of anthropomorphizing them, putting them in a stroller. I think some people maybe have crossed that line.
Hassan, have you crossed any of those lines where your Dalmatian is concerned? I do note, and I do generally approve of the practice, mind you, that you have given him a basic human being's name.
Look, that's a sigh of guilt from me there, because I've described myself as a dog dad
There you
times.
go. There it is.
My dog is called Dale Cooper. He has a first and a second name. So yeah, I mean, I'm guilty of the anthropomorphizing of my pet for sure. However, I will say that, you know, there is something to be said about the affection that leads to, and therefore the care that's required, that I think people sometimes underestimate with a puppy or with a pet generally. Like when you get a dog, I mean, I'd done like 8 or 9 months of like prep. I got so excited about it. I was not in any way prepared for what was about to happen to me when I got this puppy, and it got in the way of so many things, and it basically like completely destroyed my life outside of work. Like I had to just be there for the puppy, and I sometimes manically Googled like what you know, how hard is this, like, and people were making these comparisons online between being a parent and being like a dog owner, and they were saying, some people, I know this is anecdotal, but they were saying it's harder to have a puppy to begin with than a kid, because it can run around, it can get into all sorts of trouble, and you kind of have to be there.
Well, that's true. I mean,
time.
Baby is not going to dig up your potted plants or chew all your books, at least not early on. I should let our listeners in, Hassan, on the fact that you did, short of choosing a Weimaraner, pick about the most ridiculous breed you could possibly have taken. I mean, Weimaraners are just, I mean, lovely dogs, but they are insane. And the one you chose is not far off.
No, the one I chose happened to be a Dalmatian, and that also happened to be its reputation being very crazy, stubborn, almost impossible to train, which I didn't really fully grasp until after I got it in my defence. Why that happened, originally I wanted a Staffy, okay? Lovely dogs, they don't have the same reputation, really good, a very popular dog in the UK. But my partner would not relent on the idea of us getting a dog. She was saying that too much work. I probably should have listened at this stage.
Probably.
But I found one moment of weakness in her saying no, and that was when I mentioned the breed Dalmatian. So then I went for that as my pitch, and here we are.
And there's your solution. You can blame her. Problem solved. We shall move on with a warning at this point to any German employees of Tesla who are listening to the Monocle Daily while helping themselves to a sick day. Return to your bed immediately and stick the thermometer in boiling water. Managers at the company's Berlin factory have been dispatched to the homes of a couple of dozen Tesla workers who are signed off on long-term sick leave in order to check that they are actually as infirm as they claim to be. The move has played predictably badly with the pertinent trade union, who are of the view that management's time and energy could be better spent making Tesla a less stressful place to work. Mariella, there's obviously, with this as everything else, no nuanced middle ground position here. Pick a side. Where are your sympathies?
Well, as an employee and not an employer, I'm definitely maybe more biased towards siding with the employees. However,
are you some sort of communist? Is that what you are?
I wouldn't like to affiliate myself on air.
Okay.
But I can see both sides, because obviously as an employer you want to make sure that your employees are putting in the work to earn the money that they have been given. However, we also, I think employees should also be given the kind of respect and trust potentially to be sick when they sign off sick. However, as we can tell, I think there was a 5% increase in sick days on Fridays from the report that the managing director found. And that would imply that since the working conditions don't change over the course of the week, that there is maybe not some complete truth-telling from employees.
Yeah, obviously nobody at this table has ever in their entire lives called in sick when they were other than deathly ill. But,
God, no.
But at Tesla, Hassan, it says here, at this particular factory, 200 staff have not shown up for work this year at all. They are still being paid. Now, I'm absolutely, to be clear, in favour of employers covering their employees when they're ill. That's fine. But at what point is an employer entitled to start, wondering, really?
No, I kind of agree with this. I mean, I'd probably try and always be on the side of the worker and the employee, just because the history shows you that usually they're the ones that are left not
Indeed so.
Yeah, not quite as well off as the employer. But if you haven't been to work for 9 months and you're just sending maybe a fairly similar doctor's note every week or whatever it might be, the manager of the company coming up to check in, that could almost be sort of skewed as a duty of care rather than just a kind of, evil draconian attempt to bring you back into the workplace when you're still ill. So with that amount of time off work, my sympathies at the moment, which is strange to say, align with Tesla.
Is there, though, an amount, can, I guess, employees of the world, Mariella, claim an amount of karmic payback here for the fact that, and I have heard of this happening, people calling in being quite legitimately sick and saying, I can't come into work because I'm really ill. And I have heard this among friends of mine, their bosses saying, oh, that's fine, you can work from home.
Well, I think, having been in that situation myself before, I think there is an amount of effort that is required in getting dressed, taking the train, being present, sat upright at a desk all day. And when you are feeling ill, I think there is something to be said for being able to sit in your pajamas on the sofa. And I think if you are just working from a laptop, I do think that it is possible that you might be able to still work, even if you are feeling somewhat ill, and work to a better efficiency if you work from home. However, I do understand that it's hard to gauge that from an employer's perspective. And if they're saying they're sick, there is maybe the question that turns up in your mind of, are they actually doing anything?
Is this, though, just finally on this, Hassan, part of the ongoing, I think, attempts by both employers and employees to figure out, post the working from home boom that the pandemic encouraged, how employment is actually going to work from here on? Because it has changed, and it has changed permanently. I mean, I still notice this in that the tube I used to get in, if I was coming in to present the briefing, the tube I would get at about 9:30, 3 or 4 years ago, was always absolutely rammed. It's now always not nearly empty, but there's always a seat. It is noticeable that the tubes are much less crowded at rush hours on Mondays and Fridays in particular. We're not going back to the 9 to 5 working week, are we?
No, I think it's actually quite astonishing. We do talk about it a lot, but it is quite astonishing to think of the sort of quiet revolution that's taken place in our understanding of the working week and work practices. Because, if you say to someone, I'm in 5 days a week, sometimes it's almost like a gasp of 5 days? That was normal, just a few years ago. I don't know if you remember, but so I think people have just completely and utterly established this flexible approach to working, and it has become more explicit in conversation as a better way to approach work. As Mariella was saying earlier as well to me, that, people are challenging even the length of days of the week. So the 4-day week argument's becoming popular around the world. I think it's a good conversation to have, but I don't think it's a one size fits all. I enjoy coming in 5 days a week, even though I'm paid to say that.
Hassan Addison and Mariella Bevan, thank you both for joining us. You are listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and though Norway owes its colossal wealth principally to its reserves of old-school fossil fuels, it seems poised to do at least as well with newfangled carbon-neutral energy. Yesterday, Norway opened the world's first commercial carbon capture and storage facility, and I'm joined now from Oslo by Monocle's Gunnar Gronlid, who has been there. Gunnar, is there a way you can first explain where this thing is and then give us some idea what it looks like? What do you see when you go there? What is even a carbon capture and storage facility?
Andrew, yeah, so this new facility by the company Northern Lights is located in Øygarden, which is on the west coast of Norway. It's part of this long chain of archipelagos, about 50-minute drive away from Bergen. And what it looks like, I can only describe it as a very futuristic, extremely complex looking set of huge 20 to 30 meter tall tanks. They're extremely shiny, looks extremely complicated. There's just a million tubes and pipes going all over the place. That's how I would describe it.
Is it possible to explain as briefly as possible, especially to a presenter who understands and comprehends nothing of technology, how this thing is supposed to work?
So basically, the way that carbon capture and storage works is in emission-heavy industries like oil and gas, like cement production, steel production, instead of letting the CO2 that is emitted from those processes just go out into the atmosphere, you catch it as it's coming out, and then you liquefy it, and then it needs to go, in this case, to some place like the Northern Lights facility, where it's been liquefied, and then it's reheated and pressurized, and then it's sent through pipes down into a place where it will be permanently stored. In the case of the Northern Lights facility, that location is 100 kilometers off the coast into the sea and 2,600 meters below the seafloor. So there's a particular layer below the seafloor that is especially suited for storing carbon. So they pump it down there, and then the idea is that it will remain there permanently and not affect the climate.
You spoke at this thing to Norway's energy minister. What kind of hopes do they have for it?
Basically, the hope here, which some people are a bit critical of, but the idea is this should allow us to keep going with emission-heavy industries like oil and gas, like cement and steel. It's particularly important for things that are called hard-to-abate industries. That would be cement and steel, which is industries where we need these industries. But so far, there are no useful, viable alternatives that we can use that won't emit carbon. And so the idea is that it should allow us to keep doing these things, but make them carbon neutral. And so, like you said, I spoke to the energy minister who was at the Northern Lights Summit event yesterday, launching this thing. And I spoke to him a bit about Norway's sort of dream for this thing.
First of all, we have over several decades worked with different kind of solutions to catch CO2 and then store it permanently. That in the Norwegian continental shelf, we have 30 years of experience with the storing of CO2, and we have established technology center Mongstad to develop the catching technology. Today we are working with the storage capacity to increase the storing capacity in the future, so we can bring this project over in a commercial value chain for carbon capture and storage for also the European market.
Now, to be clear, Gunnar, this does not mean that Norway intends to get entirely out of the fossil fuel business. Is Norway hoping to have the best of both worlds?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Because so Terje Aasland, the energy minister, he has said very clearly that to completely phase out oil and gas, that's not on the cards. And that's for all sorts of reasons. Obviously, it's what made Norway rich. We're not exactly excited to be giving up our one big export card. So we want to keep that by making it carbon neutral. But at the same time, Norway has a huge opportunity here. The reason why we are especially poised to have this carbon capture and storage facility is because of the oil directorate's huge bank of knowledge about the seafloor, about the Norwegian continental shelf. And there's, of course, huge opportunities there as well for actual renewable energy technologies. So I asked the energy minister about that as well, how he thinks about balancing these investments.
We have to do both. We have to bring new technologies and new opportunities available for the industry in the hard-to-abate sector. And also in the Norwegian government targets, we will build out more renewable energy, offshore wind power plants, and especially focus on floating offshore wind, who can be really important from a Norwegian industry perspective and from the government perspective, because I think when you're talking about a lot of renewable energy from different kind of sources, I think floating offshore wind will be a really important technology to bring down the costs, to make it available in a good way. And next year we will award license to have a competition on floating offshore wind. And I'm really looking forward to that when that happened.
And Gunnar, just finally, if this is the world's first and therefore Norway's first commercial carbon capture and storage facility, is anybody talking about building a second and third yet?
Yes, I mean, the way that they really pitched this to the delegates of European policymakers and industry leaders at the summit is that this is very much a sort of lighthouse project. This is supposed to sort of shine a light on, look, we can do this because carbon capture and storage has a very storied, controversial history where there were loads of failed projects. Norway believes it's sort of ready to do this and bring it to market because of its huge knowledge bank from the oil industry. It's basically translating the knowledge it has from oil into this new technology. It seems like it's going to be a feasible thing into the future, hopefully.
Gunnar Grönlid, thank you for joining us. Finally, on today's show, last time the Wall Street Journal's chief foreign affairs correspondent Yaroslav Trofimov was on the Daily, it was to introduce Our Enemies Will Vanish, his chronicle of the early phases of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The book he's discussing this time, No Country for Love, is also set in Ukraine and also amid conflict, but it's a novel. I spoke to Yaroslav at Midori House earlier and began by asking what had compelled him to try his hand at fiction.
I think some things are easier in a novel. And I got the idea of writing a novel when I was doing a nonfiction book about the Siege of Mecca in 1979, which is sort of a thriller. But I found myself really frustrated by the fact that, reality is messy and the narrative is messy. It goes and twists and turns out. I caught myself thinking, I wish I could cut this out. I wish I could make a composite character. And you can't, obviously, in a non-fiction book.
And yet this is, we should be clear, historical fiction. This is set in a definite time at a particular place and all of that kind of thing. So there must have been a certain amount of the reporter's obsessive fact-checking still going on.
Oh, yeah, plenty. So the novel, No Country for Love, it's based loosely, very loosely, on my grandmother's life and the tales that she told me about her life. It was probably the darkest period in Ukrainian history. At the time when Ukraine was the deadliest place on earth. 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. There was the Holodomor, the artificial famine that Stalin had orchestrated. There was the war, the Holocaust, the insurgency, and the crackdown on the insurgency after the war. When I started writing the novel, she had already passed away. And so I went back to Ukraine and I really tried to visit all the locations, also in Russia because Stalingrad is part of the narrative there. And also I went through the newspapers of the time. I spent weeks in the library in Kiev just pouring through those old newspapers from the 1930s, looking at the weird ads they had at the time, trying to reconstruct reality as much as possible.
Your protagonists are obviously existing in very compromised circumstances, which you have just described, and people are having to make decisions about their own survival versus what they think is actually the right and proper thing to do. Was there something about Ukraine's current predicament that drew you back to that? Do you see echoes of then in the sorts of decisions people are having to make now?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. The book itself was actually finished before this current large-scale invasion began.
Okay.
I started writing this book in 2014 when I was in Kabul as the Wall Street Journal's bureau chief. And when the first Russian invasion began in Crimea and Donbass, and I was really frustrated at how little was known about Ukraine, its history, its culture, and whatever was known through the Russian eyes, through the lens of Russian colonialism, because all the knowledge was coming via Moscow and was distorted. And so in a way, the idea of the novel was to explain the tragic history of Ukraine, to explain Ukraine, but through, this tale of murder, love, betrayal, and, that has its own narrative and its own propulsion. Once I finished the novel, literally, I submitted the novel in December 2021. And there are scenes in the novel of the destruction of Kiev, bombardments during World War II. And, a month and a half later, I was seeing this with my own eyes, and as Russian tanks were on the outskirts of Kiev, as bombs were falling on the city. So it was really surreal. But I think if you look at the novel now, it really explains the resilience of Ukraine today. Because everyone in Ukraine has family like me, has grandparents, great-grandparents, who are the survivors of this tragic period. They had to, sacrifice, make unimaginable efforts to just survive that meat grinder of history, that onslaught. I think in the minds of many Ukrainians, all Ukrainians probably, there's this understanding that no matter how hard it is now in the war, with all the casualties, the alternative is worse. The alternative is this past that, the rules of Russia want to resurrect. And it's very telling that the very first thing that happens when Russian troops seize a Ukrainian town, they usually demolish the monument to the victims of the famine because they claim it never happened. So it's the sort of the never again feeling in Ukraine. And I tap into this in this book because I'm trying to illustrate what is this never again that Ukrainians don't want to repeat itself.
Did you have to impose an amount of discipline on yourself to avoid drawing in, to keep it, that is, to the ordinary people whose extraordinary lives you catalogue, rather than bringing in the big historical recognisable figures? There is, I think, a cameo appearance by someone who is fairly clearly Walter Duranty, the New York Times rather disreputable Moscow correspondent of that period. But other than that, you kept it very much to the lives of these people.
Well, I also, it's Walter Duranty obviously is well known, but to Ukrainian readers reading this, they also recognize the flower of the Ukrainian cultural elite, because there's a scene in the book where my protagonist goes to the building called Slova, the word, which was this building housing the writers and the poets and the artists of the Ukrainian Renaissance in the 1930s in Kharkiv. And she has all those interactions and conversations with them, and I refer to them on the first name basis in the book. But students of Ukrainian literature immediately recognize who it is. And the fact that we don't know, the wider world does not know their names, is because they were all executed. A year later, pretty much the cream of the Ukrainian intelligentsia in 1930-1931 was rounded up, sent to the camps in northern Russia and Karelia, and then executed with one bullet to two heads because they tried to save in bullets.
The period you're writing about is obviously, as you've said, very far from ancient history. This is stuff that happened to the grandparents of people alive now. Is it your sense that in the last 2.5 years in particular, there is something about that period that Ukrainians have drawn on, that there is a folk memory there, this idea that we got through that, we can get through this?
There is that too, but also there is a feeling that this is not ancient history. It's all of a sudden very much resonating, also because of what's happening in Russia. Because, Stalin was not really openly venerated since the mid-1950s in Russia. Now, all of a sudden, there is this cult of the past. They're going back to the same, really exterminationist rhetoric about the Ukrainians. And if you read the leading Russian political analysts and commentators, their plan for Ukraine in case of victory is kind of going back to what the Soviets did in the 1930s, to take the Ukrainian elites and to exterminate them physically.
Just finally, and I guess this is a part B to part A, the first question I asked about why a novel. When you sit down as a reporter, as a non-fiction writer, to be a novelist, an artist, is there any sense of imposter syndrome you have to get past? Did you ever find yourself thinking, God, what the hell am I doing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think, the first thing I had to do was to unlearn a lot of things you learn as a journalist, because, you have to not be a journalist, so you have to strangle, much of your own way of writing things. And then the most frightening moment was to show the result to people. And all of a sudden, oh, wow, people actually like it. Oh, people are reviewing it and they think it's good. So but I don't know, there was one of the novelists who endorsed it. And I talked to him about the imposter syndrome. He said, well, I've written 5 novels. Every time I write one, I have an imposter syndrome. I think it's natural.
That was Yaroslav Trofimov, chief foreign correspondent of the Wall Street Journal. His novel, No Country for Love, is available now. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Mariella Bevan, Hassan Anderson, and to HJ Mai, Gunnar Gronlid and Hannah McCarthy. Today's show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Sana Jamani. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening.
2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.